character of God defines us not by our origins, not by our biology, not by our worst days or our hardest diagnoses, not by what any man or any darkness has spoken over us, but by what He declared over us before the world began. Your life is not a mistake, no matter how hard it's been.
Thanks for joining us on Life Journeys, a podcast about thriving through the worst pain that life brings. With global initiatives threatening big changes to our way of life, we're going to need to activate Jesus' words about mountain-moving faith. Words That Work is the ongoing series on Life Journeys that is rooted in releasing revelational words of faith that will work every time and with everyone. It's about moving the mountains that keep us from the presence and goodness of God. It's about defining our life purpose and identity through encountering Him until we have the power to move the obstacles that are destroying our liberty and hope.
There is a price tag on my life, not a metaphor, not a sentiment, a real, actual price, paid in suffering, in years, in surgeries, in prayers whispered into the dark by a woman most of the world never noticed. And tonight I want to talk about that, about what it means to owe your existence to someone else's endurance. Because here's what I know to be true. Your life is not a mistake, no matter how hard it's been. Let me take you back to the 1940s, to a motel room across the street from a hospital, where a man, my father, lay on a bed and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep, unable to think, unable to do much of anything except drown in a decision that would determine everything. My mother had suffered a breakdown. The police had come. They'd tied her to the bed. Medical personnel had taken her away to a facility, and there she had stayed, year after year, locked inside a fog that neither love nor will could lift. My father was a man who didn't believe in God. He was angry at the church for what he felt God had allowed to happen to his family. And now, the woman he had loved for years was somewhere across that street, and he had to decide. The surgery they were proposing was a lobotomy. In the 1940s, that was not a routine procedure. It was dangerous. It could kill her. But without it, the doctor said, she might never leave that place. Can you sit with that for a moment? Can you feel the weight of it? You love someone. You have loved them for years, and now their life, the whole of it, rests in your two hands. The stress doesn't just burden you. It paralyzes you. You can't think straight. You can't see the future no matter which road you choose. You are completely, utterly alone with a question that has no good answer. And then something happened. My father saw a vision. There on the wall of that motel room, Jesus stood before a hillside full of sheep, and in front of him, a cradle. It happened 2 nights in a row, as if God himself wanted to make sure my father didn't mistake it for a dream. And years later, when I was told that story for the first time, I understood immediately what my father had seen. He had seen me. Before I was born, before he'd made his decision, he had seen the son he didn't yet know. My parents had been childless for 17 years, and God, in that vision, was telling my father something both simple and staggering. She will not die, and you will not be childless forever. Let her have the surgery. I am with you. He did. She survived. And 2 years later, I was born. My grandmother had been praying for my mother long before any of that. She was a godly woman, the kind of woman whose prayers don't just echo through a room but seem to travel through time. She had interceded for her youngest daughter, and she prayed until she knew, the way some people just know, that God was going to answer. I exist because of that woman's faithfulness. I have never fully been able to hold that thought without feeling something collapse inside me in the best possible way. And then there was my mother's sister, who gave up her own prospects, her own chance at marriage, at a life of her own, to come and live with my parents and help care for my mother. She set aside her future so that ours could exist. I am the result of tremendous sacrifice, of supernatural grace, arriving in a very dark place. Here's the question that haunts me, though, because I want to be honest with you. There were nights I wondered, there are probably nights you wonder, what good is a life like that? What good is a life of suffering with no visible fruit? My mother sat in her chair. She had toast and coffee. She rarely went anywhere. She never taught a Sunday school class, never sang in a choir, never held an office, never built anything the world would have called remarkable. She and my father fought. She struggled with anger. He got violent. What was the point of all that pain? But here is what I've come to understand, slowly, like eyes adjusting to light after a long darkness. She prayed for me. She endured. She struggled. And for years, while I was living as what I can only describe as a bum, she never gave up on me. I am the fruit of someone else's faithfulness. Someone sacrificed. And God heard. Just one person. Her one person. That's all she needed to be. Today I've been a minister for nearly 50 years. But more than that, I have eternal life. I have a wife who turned my house into a home. I have 3 daughters, each of them born through what I can only call a supernatural work of God after years of waiting. And God told my wife under the morning stars not long ago that because we loved him, he would be faithful to our children to 1,000 generations. 1,000 generations. Because one woman sat in a chair and drank her coffee and never stopped believing in Jesus. Who can say her life was wasted? After I was discharged from the military, one night I had a hangover. God came into my living room anyway. That's the kind of God we're talking about. The kind who shows up in motel rooms, in living rooms, and hospital wards. The kind who gives visions to men who don't believe in him, and who honors the prayers of grandmothers and the suffering of mothers, and who holds the whole chain of a family's story in his hands across generations. I think about the early Christians, the ones who were martyred, who suffered, who kept the gospel message alive across 2,000 years of empire and fire and persecution. I have eternal life partly because of them, people whose names I will never know, people who never knew mine. 'Tis grace that taught my heart to fear, the old hymn says. And then, and grace, my fears relieved. That's the whole arc of it, isn't it? Grace first breaks you open with the sheer weight of what God has done, of what others have paid on your behalf. And then it catches you before you fall. Isaiah writes, "Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. Since you were precious in my sight, you have been honored, and I have loved you." God spoke those words to a nation he was about to send into captivity for 70 years. Even that didn't break the covenant. Even that didn't change the love. Nothing changes the love. 75 years ago, God showed my father a vision of a boy in a cradle. My wife and I were born on the same day, in the same year. I've thought about that for a long time. That God, at the same moment he was comforting a frightened man in a motel room, was also, already, preparing the person who would become my wife. That even then, he was weaving 2 lives together who hadn't been born yet toward a future neither of them could see. That's not sentiment. That's the character of a God who defines us not by our origins, not by our biology, not by our worst days or our hardest diagnoses, not by what any man or any darkness has spoken over us, but by what he declared over us before the world began. We are defined by the throne room, not by our failures, not by the broken places in our family trees, not by the years we spent lost, by the throne room. And so I'll close with this. If my parents had not endured, if they had broken in their deepest valleys, I would not have been born. My children wouldn't exist. My grandchildren wouldn't exist. The lives I've had the privilege of touching over 5 decades of ministry would have remained untouched. One struggling woman, one man with a vision in a motel room, one grandmother on her knees in the dark. That's all it took. So if you're sitting somewhere tonight wondering what your life is worth, wondering if any of it matters, if the suffering has a point, if God has forgotten the address of your particular valley, I want you to hear this. Your life is not a mistake, not despite how hard it's been. Sometimes because of how hard it's been. You don't know yet what is growing in the dark. You don't know whose future depends on your faithfulness right now, in this exact season, even if it looks like nothing from the outside. A life was given for me, and I intend to honor it.
You can unlock the presence of God in your life. There are revelation principles that remove the mountains, keeping us from joy, hope, peace, and purpose when our world gets turned upside down. Look for these words that work with Pastor Hardica as he shares what has helped him when life got hard. And don't forget to check out his book, The Fortress and the Firebrand, available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Thanks for listening to Life Journeys.
The character of God defines us not by our origins, not by our biology, not by our worst days or our hardest diagnoses, not by what any man or any darkness has spoken over us, but by what he declared over us before the world began. Your life is not a mistake. No matter how hard it's been,